Oh boy, the 2024 Democratic primary is going to be a blast. Joe Biden all but said he will not run in this election, so that means it's an open field for the Democrats once more. So many people could run for the nomination, like Ro Khanna, Roy Cooper, maybe even Bernie Sanders. Man, we're about to have a really good, interesting time.
Whisper, 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 whisper.
Wait, he's running?
Whisper, whisper, whisper.
And everyone endorsed him? Dang it. I guess we got a bunch of nobodies who want to run against him, don't we? But who can we classify as an other? Is it just Joe Biden versus the rest? Well, in Mr. Beat's 2024 video, he name drops two Joe Biden challengers, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and Dean Phillips. Mentioning these two is a bit of a stretch, but hey, I guess if he's going to mention them, I'll mention the rest. Since these guys refuse to let humanity move forward past them, let us go over the candidates that were only on the ballot in New Hampshire. First, we have Richard Rist, who got 37 votes. Perennial candidate Raymond Michael Morrose, who got 52 votes. Perennial candidate Tom Coos, who got 71 votes. Paul V. LaCava, who got 176 votes. Artist and perennial candidate Paperboy Love Prince, who got 326 votes. John Vale, who got 685 votes. Perennial candidate Vermin Supreme, who got 912 votes. And Derek Nadeau, who got 1,616 votes. For the candidates who were on the ballot in one different state, we have Mark R. Praskak in Nevada with 33 votes, Stephen Allen Leon in Nevada with 89 votes, Brent Fouts in Nevada with 93 votes, Super Piacerio Crystal Rock in Nevada with 133 votes, 2012 presidential candidate John D. Haywood in Nevada with 241 votes, and perennial candidate Bob Eli in Louisiana with 2,652 votes. Above them, we have candidates who were on the ballot in two states. First, we have Donald Picard on the ballot in New Hampshire and Nevada. He got 495 votes. Next, we have perennial presidential candidate Mark Stewart Greenstein on the ballot in New Hampshire and Vermont with 912 votes. Next, we have perennial presidential candidate Robert Starlock on the ballot in New Hampshire and Texas, getting 8,661 votes. Next, we have former President of Democrats for Life of America, Teresia Bukovinak, running a campaign on keeping Roe v. Wade illegal, a message that the Democratic Party was desperately yearning to hear in that election. She was on the ballot in New Hampshire and New Jersey, getting 14,280 votes, so maybe that sarcastic remark is actually not as sarcastic as it should have been. And lastly, we have 2020 independent presidential candidate, President R19 Body, on the ballot in New Hampshire and California, who ended up getting 25,591 votes. And the level above them, we have candidates who were on a significant amount of ballots, who mounted bids that, while not necessarily nothing, were not massive enough to make that big of a splash in the race. First, we have Ebon Cambridge, who, despite little to no presence, was on the ballot in New Hampshire, California, Minnesota, and North Dakota. He ended up getting 13,044 votes. Next, we have entrepreneur and 2022 congressional candidate Frankie Lozada, who was on the ballot in New Hampshire, Nevada, Arkansas, Colorado, Minnesota, Texas, Utah, Arizona, Illinois, and Louisiana. He ended up receiving 37,770 votes. Next, we have plumber Stephen P. Lyons, who was running as a conservative candidate. He was on the ballot in New Hampshire, Nevada, Arkansas, California, Colorado, Oklahoma, Arizona, Louisiana, Missouri, North Dakota, Wyoming, and West Virginia. He ended up receiving 42,630 votes. Next, we have entrepreneur Gabriel Cornejo, who was on the ballot in New Hampshire, Nevada, California, Colorado, Minnesota, Texas, Utah, and Arizona. He ended up receiving 71,750 votes. Next, we have businessman and 2022 California gubernatorial candidate Armando Perez Cerrato, who was on the ballot in New Hampshire, Nevada, Arkansas, California, Colorado, Minnesota, Oklahoma, Texas, Hawaii, Louisiana, Missouri, North Dakota, Wyoming, West Virginia, Idaho, South Dakota, and DC. He ended up receiving 82,372 votes. And last but certainly not least, we have host of the Young Turks, co-founder of Justice Democrats, 2022 California congressional candidate, and Hassan Piker's uncle, Cenk Uygur. Cenk was the most notable from this crowd, not necessarily exclusively because of his fame, although that did play a heavy part. What was more interesting about him was his explicit intention in the race. While most of the people up to this point are basically just political gadflies that put their name on the ballot and get, whatever small fame, Cenk doesn't need to do that. Cenk is already famous. So why would he run? Well, Cenk believed that the reason why he needed to run was because nobody else would. Well, nobody notable would. Cenk, like basically everybody else in this video, wasn't really the biggest fan of Joe Biden. And while Cenk had historically been a vote blue no matter who guy, and granted he still was, he just felt that this time Joe Biden was not going to win, particularly citing his age and obvious declining mental health. That, combined with policy weakness, made him worry that Joe Biden would lose in a massive landslide to Donald Trump. So he publicly tried to get a progressive Democrat to run against him. But soon he basically just said I'd be fine with any prominent Democrat running against him, and decided to basically launch a stalking horse campaign where he would run just to open the door and test the waters for someone else to do it instead. However, there was a secondary reason why Cenk Uygur wanted to run for president, and it was really because of the one main reason why Cenk Uygur running for president wasn't the best idea for this strategy. And that was the fact that Cenk Uygur is not a natural-born citizen of the United States, one of the few requirements you need to be president of the United States. Cenk's excuse being that there was nothing saying that he couldn't run. And that is true, there have been people who have ran that have broken this rule before. But of course, what happens if they win? We'll never know because they never get a chance. But Cenk also wanted to use this campaign as a way to end this requirement to be president of the United States, citing the Supreme Court case Schneider v. Rusk, which ruled that it is unconstitutional to treat naturalized and natural-born citizens differently from each other. And Cenk was preparing for a massive legal battle about this, getting into drama regarding the ballots in Nevada, Arkansas, South Carolina, and New Hampshire, because he never filled in the part that said he is a natural citizen of the United States, even defacing the Nevada ballot paper in order to protest that requirement. But shock of all shocks, there was no legal battle to be had because the rules are pretty clear. Unless they're changed, nothing is going to happen. However, other states that weren't as picky as these four were Vermont, Minnesota, Texas, North Dakota, Louisiana, Oklahoma, and Connecticut, ultimately ending up receiving 20,985 votes. However, we do have one more tier above these guys. The two people who could have also potentially gotten name dropped in this video, but they just barely made the mark, for reasons that are slightly obvious once we get into them. First, we have venture capitalist Jason Michael Palmer. Palmer was a bit of an interesting candidate, seemingly trying to run a populist campaign focused on ideological centrism. Think Ross Perot and Andrew Yang. Even running on something eerily similar to the latter via something called conscious capitalism, i.e. rewarding companies that are ethical with tax breaks. Palmer's central focus of the campaign was the idea of moving towards the future, hyping up the fact that he was considered young based on most of the other candidates' ages, making a push for not only Biden, but for every single old Democrat to pass the torch to younger Democrats. Another thing that hammered in the moving towards the future message was the fact that Palmer made the use of various technologies during his campaign, making a lot of campaign appearances over Zoom and using artificial intelligence not only to send text messages to a lot of people, but also created an AI version of himself so that you could ask him directly questions about the campaign. With his tech and money, Palmer managed to get on the ballot in 13 states, the Northern Mariana Islands, and American Samoa. The last one being very notable because he actually ended up winning the caucus by 11 people, because Palmer put a half-decent effort in the area despite never setting foot there and only having 3 staffers spread his message, which made Palmer the first person to be an incumbent president in a presidential primary since 1980. Now, are these two bids really comparable? Not really. A caucus where less than 100 people showed up and basically just decided to give Biden and him a statistical tie in the delegate count. However, to the others, they saw Palmer as a god, Cornejo, Lozada, and Lyons deciding to suspend their bids and endorse Palmer as he became the de facto most viable alternative to Joe Biden. Although, after a couple of media interviews, nothing really came out of it except for the fact that Palmer got 21,271 votes. And lastly, we have 2020 presidential candidate Marianne Williamson. Now, on a first glance, you might be confused as to why she, of all people, decided to run. Of the 20
plus
Democratic candidates in the last race, she got
14th place.
In fact, she got worse results than a person that I labeled as one of the others. So, why did she do it? Well, according to Marianne, she wanted to launch a McCarthy-like primary bid that would run to Biden's left, with the idea being that she'd beat him so badly in New Hampshire that he'd be forced to drop out. And on a first glance, that sounds like an amazing idea. But then after thinking about it for longer than 2 seconds, you start seeing some holes in the theory. For starters, the Democrats were desperately trying to get South Carolina to be the first state in the primary. But since New Hampshire wasn't budging, they basically said, you know what, screw you, this primary will award no delegates. Which ultimately led to Joe Biden to not even run in the New Hampshire primary. So, the plan was already destined to fail. Second of all, if you want to do that, you don't pick the person who got
14th
out of 23. It's not technically impossible, but she'd have to do a lot of work to even remotely come close to Joe Biden's level. You know, a thing you sorely need if you're trying to run a McCarthy-like primary bid. The reason why the McCarthy primary bid worked so well was because he was an incumbent senator. He was a prominent incumbent senator who knew exactly how to rile up an electoral base that was dissatisfied with the incumbent president and had the platform to do so. Marianne just didn't, so she was already starting off on a bad leg. But hey, maybe her campaign would prove us wrong. Then people actually saw the campaign she was running, and it didn't fill people with a lot of hope that she could do this. For starters, her campaign seemed very online focused, and not in the sense that she used the internet to organize people, in the sense that her campaign existed only online. Most of her support really stemmed from people who were just hashtagging her on Twitter as opposed to holding rallies and events for her campaign. And not just online supporters, no. It seems that she only tried to inherit the worst aspects of online political hashtag activism that you could find. You know, people that would go around saying things like, you have to support Marianne Williamson because she's the only Democrat running against Joe Biden. Ones that would be very hardline on critiquing Joe Biden, but if you levied any critique to Marianne, you'd be labeled a heathen and a fake progressive and blah blah blah, even if those criticisms were 100% completely valid. If you bring up the fact that Marianne Williamson had some strange vaccine hesitancy statements, you'll be met with, well, that was just one time a million years ago. You bring up the fact that it's not one time a million years ago. In fact, she's had a long history of making strange statements in regards to vaccines, appearing on shows that are openly anti-vax. Made a statement right before the COVID lockdown that she believed that
Vaccine mandates were Orwellian.
and had literally made statements during this race claiming the government was suppressing some sort of truth regarding ivermectin and the other fake healing thing that they made up. Even going so far as to claim that you're not a real left-winger, progressive, or whatever if you don't openly support Marianne Williamson. Which is odd, because, left-wing progressive ideals have existed for hundreds of years before Marianne Williamson, and they'll exist long after her, so I don't understand why this specific race is needed to justify you being a progressive of some kind. And when you look into the origins of the Marianne Williamson campaign, it makes complete and total sense. Because Marianne Williamson was pressured into running in this race by online progressive pundits Crystal Ball and Kyle Kulinski. The former, you may remember, for pushing Richard Ojeda into launching a dead-on-arrival presidential campaign because of a decent congressional run. With these two and other members of the indie media progressive sphere forming a symbiotic relationship with her bid, similar to a previous one with a lot of pundits and Tulsi Gabbard. It starts off as your standard stuff, we're covering this candidate objectively, we're inviting him onto an interview objectively. They both get a natural boost because of course people are going to watch those videos and maybe go to her campaign and donate to her. They both mutually benefit from this exchange. But negative publicity only goes so far for her bid, so she can't really focus her attention on all the people who are talking crap about her. So naturally, these guys, in order to get her back on the show, they'll give her softball interviews, or just flat out give her positive coverage even when she's not there. And considering the fact that every single person in this interaction are friends, it's a little bit suspicious, don't you think? But hey, maybe that's just the worst part of her campaign. Why don't we actually check into actual campaign work? Well, this is where we're starting to see a lot more holes, because Marianne seemed to have a lot of issues in regards to campaign staff, going through at least 3 campaign managers over the course of her bid, with many other campaign staffers leaving as well. It could have been a continuation of the abusive nature of her 2020 bid, or it could have to do with the fact that she really didn't want to pay attention to her staffers' concerns, their biggest one being ballot access. Why would that be important for a presidential campaign? Her staffers suggesting that Marianne Williamson launch initiatives to get on the ballot in as many states as she can, but Marianne decided to go in a different plan. Alright, let's hear it. Do nothing, fail to get on the ballot, and then whine about it on Twitter. Brilliant. Let's use my homeland of North Carolina as an example. In order to get on the ballot in North Carolina, you need to fulfill all of the federal legal requirements,
but you also needed to be either generally advocated and recognized in the news media throughout the United States or in North Carolina, aka appearing in presidential debates and or federally recognized polls. A thing that Marianne knew was not going to happen due to her running her bid almost exclusively about how the DNC and the mainstream media was biased against her or circumvent that requirement via 2 other available methods to appear on the ballot.
You had to submit either 10,000 signatures or actively campaign in the state. That's it. That's all you have to do to prove that you're serious about running for president. Marianne Williamson did neither, and yet still complained that she wasn't allowed on the ballot. However, Marianne continued as if nothing happened, at most responding to organizer memes on Twitter, who was one of the most vocal Marianne opponents. And that's when the first results of the race came in. And considering she got
3rd
place to a write-in bid by Biden, she made the announcement that she would be suspending her bid on February 7th of 2024. However, on February 28th of 2024, Marianne Williamson announced that she would be unsuspending her bid, citing growing discontent with Joe Biden, thinking that she had an outlet to fulfill their needs. However, the discontent with Biden had absolutely nothing to do with Marianne Williamson, so naturally, it did not correlate to Marianne Williamson doing any better. So, on June 11th of 2024, Marianne Williamson would announce that she would be resuspending her bid because it was clear nobody liked her. And then came the first presidential debate And Joe Biden's performance made many Democrats concerned about him and decided that they should pressure him to drop out of the race and pick somebody else to run. Marianne Williamson heard this and said, "Third time's the charm," and unsuspended her bid on July 2nd to rally delegates to support her bid, which makes no sense considering her whole campaign was about how the Democratic Party was trying to rig it against her. So then why would the people that she says is rigging it against her vote for her to be the presidential nominee? And Marianne Williamson learned this too, so she decided to re-suspend her bid on July 29th of 2024. And this time she actually kept true to that message. Overall, she was on the ballot in 32 states, plus DC, Puerto Rico, Democrats Abroad, Northern Mariana Islands, and the Virgin Islands. And she ended up getting 491,811 votes, with nobody doing better than Marianne. No, I'm being serious. There were 706,591 people who decided voting for nobody was the best route for them electorally in this primary, most if not all of them being people who protested against Biden for various reasons, either just the idea that he was seemingly running unopposed, or his policies regarding Palestine. Pretty embarrassing for all of these guys that a lot of people would rather pick nobody over them. But hey, the process pulled out, so it looks like Joseph Robinette Biden will be the Democratic nominee against Donald John Trump for the second time in a row.
Whisper, whisper, whisper.
Scratch that, apparently Kamala Harris was chosen to be the nominee, even though nobody voted for her. I mean, hey, maybe she addresses the concerns. What's the worst that could happen? That's the worst that could happen. Thanks for watching this video. Be sure to like, comment, share, subscribe, and click the bell to notify when a future video comes out. And for some more content from me, consider supporting me on Patreon.